Well, happy Mother's Day again to all of you. I'm so grateful you're here. I want to step into a new conversation today called An Introduction to Love, an invitation to a brand new understanding of love. What I want to do is explore a particular chapter in the biblical narrative. I have had some experiences with what I could only describe as love. And when I say love, we're going to get into, over the course of the next month or so, what I feel like I mean when I'm talking about love. But I have had some experiences and have, since those moments, tried to find something that is comparable to what I experienced, and I could never find anything. So oftentimes when you talk about love, particularly in our culture, you tend to think of like infatuation or romance or even like family type love. And all those things are amazing, and they certainly touch the surface a little bit. But I've had some experiences with a love that I never knew prior to the experience. And I want to try my best to explain, which I do believe it's unexplainable, but I want to try to explain, put language, put some form around what we talk about when we're talking about love. So I simply want to do this throughout the next little bit. I want to introduce us to a new way of love, a new way of understanding love. My heart is, hopefully you'll find this as kind of an invitation that I actually think, and this has been my experience with it, it has the potential to transform everything we think and feel about everything, all right? So I know that's heavy, but hang with me. I've had experiences with love that have transformed everything I think and feel of just about everything and everyone. So what I want to do is hopefully give you an invitation to a deeper, wider, and probably, we can even use this phrase, countercultural understanding of love. And to do that, I have searched through a lot of material to try to find what I believe captures my own experience of love. And what I have found is what arguably some would say is a literary masterpiece, all right? In my opinion, as a scholar from Candler School of Theology, I will tell you that the most profound chapter in the entire biblical narrative that you hold, arguably that Catholics hold as well, any version you want to use, the most profound literary writing that I think best uses descriptions to help point us toward what I'm talking about when I talk about love is actually by the man that might surprise you the most. His name is Paul, all right? And as much as maybe we want to throw Paul under the bus, if Paul didn't do anything but one thing, write 1 Corinthians 13, he's worthy of us bringing up this morning, all right? Because in my opinion, what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 13 is the most revolutionary writing the history of human civilization has ever seen, all right? That's a strong statement, but I need you to hang with me. When we get into it, you'll understand. So what I'd like to do is we're going to start at 1 Corinthians 13:1, and then we're going to work our way over the next little bit through it. Check this out. I want to get into the actual Greek, so we're going to go Greek phrase by phrase by phrase, all right? So it's going to be a good time, and my hope is that we don't share this so you can feel guilty because, I don't love like Paul is writing about. Nope. I need to tell you this. When you encounter the love that I think Paul is writing about and pointing to, and it's a love that I've had experiences with, in that presence of love, there is no guilt. There is no guilt. There's something I need you to know about this love, that this is why I'm doing this, because I want you, check it out, to have your own experience with it. And when you do have an experience with it, I won't have to say anything else. You'll know when you taste and see it, it will transform everything. And I speak from experience. My life has not quite been the same since the last encounter I had with love. All right, so that's what I want to get into. Now, to get started, let me give you a quote from Father Richard Rohr, the Franciscan guru, says this, 1 Corinthians 13, might be the supreme piece of condensed theology in the entire Bible. The whole message of Scripture is there. In this one short part of a longer letter, Paul shows himself to be an excellent philosopher, theologian, mystic, teacher, and psychologist. If he had written nothing else, he would still deserve a place in spiritual history. All right? Now, without even going to the text, when I say 1 Corinthians 13, I would imagine most of you in this room are probably like, oh, that's the passage you all share at weddings, right? You know, love is patient, love is kind. Oh, yeah, that's such an adorable passage that Paul wrote, right? Well, a couple of things. First of all, you need to know this. Some of the most poetic words ever written about love are in 1 Corinthians 13. And those words about love did not come from a wedding or romantic story. That is not the context for Paul's writing, right? The context for Paul's writing about love come from a heated church argument, all right? So, I know we want to think of this passage as wedding material, and that's fine. Use it for weddings. Wonderful. Weep, cry, feel all the emotions. I think it's beautiful. But let's read it as it is, about a people in community with other people that they don't always like, and they're in intense disagreement about a lot of major subjects. And it's in the midst of this heated debate within a family, in the midst of disagreement and separation within a collective, that Paul's like, oh, they've gained all these theological ideas and theological knowledge. They know the Torah like the back of their hand. They have self-proclamation of being deeply spiritual people. But it has occurred to Paul that they've actually missed one thing: an encounter with a love that can transform them. And so Paul's like, we need to have a conversation. All right? Now, let me give you a little context, and then we'll just start this passage. All right? Paul visited Corinth, which is a city, and began or started a spiritual collective around 51 Common Era. Okay? He writes this letter roughly around 55 Common Era, so probably 4 or 5 years after starting the collective. All right? Now, Vinings Lake started in 2006. 2005, 2006 was our first Sunday. All right? So imagine 2005, Vinings Lake starts, and then roughly around 2010, they're already on the edge of splitting, right? And so this is a spiritual collective that starts in Corinth that Paul started, and then he went out and started traveling again, comes back because he hears about what's happening, and he decides, oh, I need to write these people because as he's out traveling, he's hearing about what's going on with this collective he starts. Now, Paul is writing to this fractured and disillusioned community because they disagree on just about everything, all right? So if you start in 1 Corinthians and you work your way through the letter, what you'll find are just a series of disagreements that Paul is addressing, okay? So it isn't just one thing. It's not like, you know, you got a spiritual collective in 2000 where half of them's Democrats and half of them's Republicans, and Paul's like, well, you talk about politics, all right? No, it is literally almost like you have two completely different worldviews within the collective. Now, maybe some of you can relate to that. Do you know what it's like to be in a family setting where it feels like there are people within the family that see the world, and I mean the entire world, so different than how you and other people in the family see the world? And then you often wonder, how are we even blood relatives? How is that even possible? Because the manner in which I see the world does not compute with the manner in which you see the world. But now imagine that in every single issue. I mean, most of us in here, even if we have like family tensions, we can find a point of agreement, right? I mean, look, I shout out to Mom, Happy Mother's Day, right? I love my mom. I love my dad. I would literally jump in front of a car and push them out of the way. You know what I mean? Now, I would think about it for a second, but I would do it. I would do it. I would do it. I would do it. But the thing about, like, you know, we have our own disagreements, But I will tell you something, we've had to work through transition. This is what Paul's doing. He's trying to help the conflict here. Going, guys, we need to work through some of this stuff, all right? Because here's the thing. We have to make decisions. Do we value our relationships more than we do our theology? Do we value our relationships more than we do our politics? These are the questions that are arising. What do you really value? And I can tell you, my wife and I have had to deal with this on like interpersonal relationship levels. And there are moments where you have to put up the boundaries and say no. And then there are moments where it's like, you know what? We're putting up the boundaries. And by boundaries, I mean, we're not going to talk about politics again at Mother's Day. Do you know what I'm saying? Or Thanksgiving, or Christmas, or when the family comes together. Check this out. We know, we have boundaries. Katie and I know these things are not to be talked about. And we usually have like a point of interest. So I can tell you right now, you know, me and my dad, we talk a lot about golf because it's safe. Do you know what I mean? And occasionally golf will leak into something about theology, and we're just like, oh, God, stay clear. Let's get back to golf. So how about Rory McIlroy? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like you're steering it because you have a point where you actually can get. Most of you probably know that, right? Most of it. I mean, there may be one or two radicals in here that bust into every holiday going, I love LGBTQI+, and if you don't, you're going to, you know, I mean, very rare is that, all right? Most of you are very sensitive, you know. You just don't strike up the contention. We just got back from a family vacation. My in-laws don't drink alcohol. They don't. And I don't even know if that was real or if you were mocking me, all right? But either way, it was beautiful, all right? My in-laws don't drink alcohol, and I'm not like a big connoisseur of it. And the older I get, the harder it is for me to recover from one sip of it, you know what I mean? And so I'm not as much into it as I was. I will tell you, when I got saved from Christianity, do you know what I'm talking about? When I got liberated from Christianity, because I'd never had a drink. We were like teetotalers growing up. My dad, he grew up in like an alcoholic family, so rightfully so, right? In the terms of spiral dynamics, that's what happens when you grow up in an alcoholic family, and all you've ever seen it is abused. You've never actually seen it done in moderation, right? So you don't know the joy that can come with it. All you've seen is the heartache with it. Right. And so this is what happens with a lot of the generation before us. I say that to say, I don't roll into family vacations and been like, I'll tell you what, let me have a couple shots of bourbon here at dinner with the family. Do you know what I'm talking about? No. Paul even talks about this. He's like, everything is permissible, but not everything is profitable. You know what I'm saying? So don't flaunt your freedom out there like, woohoo, I go to Bonnings Lake, let's drink, right? You know? It's like, first of all, there might be some folks who are recovering alcoholics. Beware of that. And then second, we've got some of those in here. And then second, also say, it's a point of contention. I'm not here to cause controversy and stir up. It's not a hill that I want to die on. And so I go in and guess what I do? I make a point of affinity. Where is the affinity? It's like, well, what can we talk about, right? And that's kind of what's happening here. Although with Paul, I'll just say they never found a point of affinity. It just seemed like every subject that they would go to, there would be disagreement. So imagine me going to my dad and being like, Dad, we stay away from these conversations, but let's talk about golf. And then all of a sudden there's a fractured relationship because he thinks Rory's better than Tiger. And I'm like, no one's better than Tiger. All right. Like, let's just go. Everyone knows that. Like, that's kind of a given thing. And we get it. So imagine if there are no points where you could actually get along. This is what Paul is essentially dealing with here. And they're arguing about everything. There was deep arguments and divisions over things like social status within the collective, beliefs. So think about theology. There were different teachers. So you don't think of like one pastor. There were different teachers. And what happened in the collective is some of the group said, oh, I love the theology when Paul teaches. He's my favorite speaker. And then the other group was like, no. When Cephas comes in and speaks, that's what I love. The other was like Apollos. Apollos, hands down, one of the greatest theologians. And so they started choosing, like, I'm team Apollos, I'm team Paul. And then there was a small group. They're like, we're team Jesus. And then Paul was like, no, you're not. Get out of here. Team Jesus. You just created that category because, check it out, you're actually team hyper-spiritual, and you want people to think you're more spiritual than everybody else is in here. So you can imagine, like, this is what it means to be human. This is one of the things I love about the biblical narrative. It does not shy away from full-on humanity. Like the people look at this like this is the early church. It doesn't get any more early of the early church than 1 Corinthians. And I want to tell you something. What a mess. What a mess. So they're arguing about status. They argue about beliefs. They're arguing about their favorite speakers and teachers. Well, I don't like this speaker, and I'm not going to come to the gathering unless you have this speaker. This is what's happening. They're arguing, here's some big ones. They're arguing about sexual norms in marriage. They're arguing about what is sexual immorality. Apparently, there's a lot of things happening because there were lawsuits flying too. So this community is in great shape. Can you imagine one part, like there were people within the community suing other people within the community and they were going to court? I mean, this thing, and Paul's like, we just started 5 years ago. Like, how'd this thing get so far off the rails? There was arguments about eating food sacrificed to idols. So they would go to the market and they'd be like, as they go to the market, there'd be these food, but some of this food, the cheaper food had been like sacrificed to idols that weren't taken, so they were selling it. And there were a group of people going, you can't eat that because if you eat that, that means you're honoring the idol. And there was all this debate about which foods you can eat and which foods you can't. There was disruptions in the gathering, so we'll talk about that. All kinds of things that were happening within the gathering that was disrupting like their Sunday experience. Hang with me, put Sunday in quotes. Part of it was women's roles within leadership. Check it out. Aren't you glad we've progressed? All right? Literally, first of all, I should say, shout out to our Methodist friends for taking giant steps this week. All right? Come on. And if you're unfamiliar, I can just tell you all of our Methodist friends took some leaps, and it took a lot for them to get there, and I'm grateful they did. But they have embraced the LGBTQIA plus community, and I'm just so thankful for it. And I was talking with someone recently, like, isn't that amazing? It was just something similar not that long ago. I grew up Southern Baptist. I don't know if you know this, of how, like, Southern Baptist got started. But literally, the denomination started because it was like pro-slavery. That's how it got started. They did not repent of their pro-slavery until 1996. All right? So you look at it and you go, that's a little late to the game. You know what I mean? Like, just a little bit, all right? And then someone asked me recently, they're like, what do you think? Do you think like Southern Baptists will ever wake up and realize they were on the wrong side of history with LGBTQIA? And I'm like, it's possible, but they first need to deal with the fact that they're on the wrong side of history with women in leadership. Because if we can't get past that one, it's going to be really hard to get to the next one, right? And this is what Paul's dealing with. Paul's over here just like, what do you mean women can't teach? First of all, have you not even heard anything I've said about all these women who have made this whole space happen, all right? And I know there's a lot to say about that, which we'll save that series for women later, but in the collective, that's what was happening. There was also debates. Check this out. This is in 1 Corinthians. There were debates about Judaism, because remember, these aren't Christians, okay? So you have to remember that. These aren't Christians. These are folks coming out of Judaism, but it's like a movement within Judaism. Christianity didn't start till later, all right? So they were still like having to hold hands with what was happening like with temple worship, and a big part of it was what they wore. So you can go to 1 Corinthians, and there's a whole thing about dress and how women should dress. There's a whole thing about should people within the crowd wear veils or not wear veils. That was a whole issue. And it was like, are we liberated or are we not liberated? Is this Jesus liberating us to where we don't have to do all these things? All these conversations are happening. Class levels at the Lord's Supper, good Lord. We're going to get into that one in a couple weeks. But they were having problems with who was coming to the Lord's Supper and how much they were taking. And Lord's Supper was a little bit different back then, all right, which we'll get into. But the folks with like higher class and more money had their own little section, and they were absorbing all the food and not leaving bread left over for those who were kind of on the underside. And it became this whole debate. And so there's that. Oh, and then one real big one. Apparently they could not agree on the resurrection. So there's a big fight about the resurrection. Did it literally happen? Did it not? Is it metaphorical? Is it, how can a man rise from the dead? And so you got a group of people over here, and then Paul takes a pretty strong stance on it, all right? So we'll get into some of that. All of that said, chapter 13 is the middle of this entire letter that Paul is writing, an extended argument that you find from chapter 12 to chapter 14 on disruptions and divisions in the gathering. Chapter 12, Paul goes into a metaphor on the body. All right, so he's talking about spiritual gifts, and he said we are like one body made up of different members. You see what he's trying to do? He's trying to bring the collective together, going, no one's saying you not to be you. Yes, you might be a foot and you might be the head, but we need both of you to realize that you are not an entity within yourself. You are an entity inside of a much larger process here. And we are a small part of a larger whole. You are a small part of a larger whole. We are one body. And then Paul's going into one body and he says, yes, all of you have different gifts. Some of you are really creative writers, right? Some of you are good at finances. Yeah, good Lord, we need you, finance. Some of you have all kinds of other gifts. Paul's just saying, yeah, use them all. Wonderful. But just know, all of them come together to form one body. And then he moves into chapter 13. And it's in chapter 13 that he begins to say in verse 31 of chapter 12, now that you understand that you are a seamless unity, that you are a part of a larger whole, here's what I want you to know. I need to show you a more excellent way to live. Now, to do that, I need to get at something that you need to have an encounter with. So I'm going to do my best to give you some descriptions to help you experience what it is I'm talking about. So I want to pick up, this is 1 Corinthians 13, verse 1. We'll just read the first 3 verses today, and then as we go through the series, we'll just pick up Greek phrases and work with them, all right? So here's what Paul writes. If I speak in the tongues of humans and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now pause there. Remember, this letter's being read to a spiritual collective that can't see eye to eye on just about anything. So imagine, as I'm told, the messenger gets the letter from Paul, and he stands up in their collective. And you can imagine there's like Team Apollos, Team Paul, and they're all in there, and they're just like so angry at each other, not speaking. Could you imagine how passive-aggressive it was, too? I mean, you imagine just people just throwing shade to these people, and you can feel it. You ever been in a room and you feel it? God, sometimes I can walk in a room and I'm like, ooh, there's stuff floating around. And I was like, it ain't me, but it's floating around in here. You can feel it. And Paul's, and so he stands and he just reads it. So that's a strong opening letter. That's a strong opening sentence. If I speak in the tongues of humans and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all, look at that, all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. You see what I'm saying? We're just getting started. Some of Paul's greatest writing right here. Now, I want to get into this for just a second. First, let's talk about tongues and symbols, and then I want to talk about knowledge and faith, and then possession and body. All right, so here we go. Tongues and symbols for just a minute. Paul goes directly to the problem. He begins with their favorite gift, speaking in tongues. All right? Now, when I talk about tongues and the language of angels or humans and angels, I'm not going to give you a whole description of New Testament and tongues. I will tell you this. The Bible for Normal People recently did a podcast on tongues from a brilliant scholar who I think, God, helped me understand what it is. So you may be in here, and by the way, if you grew up like Baptist or something, you may not even really know what that is, all right? Some of you may not. In the church I grew up in, no one spoke in tongues. If you did, you weren't right with God. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, that was people who spoke in tongues were dangerous. Stay away from them, because they equated that with like the dark side. You know what I'm talking about? They're like, there was like a medium somewhere in there, and people just kind of swerved. So we stayed as far away from charismatics and Pentecostals as we possibly could. And quite frankly, the few moments where I would get involved in those, they were terrifying to me. Now, as I look back, I realize our theology in the Baptist evangelical world was much more terrifying than their theology, but their gatherings were more terrifying to me. You know what I'm talking about? I did a whole charismatic tour one time speaking because I got kicked out of the Baptist world because they didn't like my theology, so they're like, outward you go. and I had to have a job. And I was like, well, I speak. That's what I do for a living. And a buddy of mine was, he just wrote like a Christian song that just exploded. And he was like, hey, man, why don't you come on tour with me? I'm doing all these dates. And he said, and then you can just come speak before I lead. And I'm like, that sounds amazing. I was like, what are you doing? He's like, 58 cities. I'm like, 58 cities? Yeah, he wrote a song called God's Not Dead, which turned into a movie. God's Not Dead. And I went on the tour and spoke. I look back now and I just got to love all our versions, all right? And I got up and I would speak. Well, it turns out all 58 cities, a good portion of them were charismatic, like Pentecostal churches. And there's something really beautiful about speaking to those churches, because I'll tell you what, they're not like the First Baptist Church I grew up in, where people were just like, every now and then there would be some old guy in the back that would go, amen. But he never even finished it. He never even finished it. I know his name. I know exactly who he is. He would never finish the men. He would just go, hey. And we were all like in the back, and I remember as students, we'd go, men. Hey. All right. Bring the word. I was speaking at one place one time back in the day. It was like a bunch of students, and a kid in the back got so hyped up about what I was saying, he literally out loud went, retweet. That might have been one of the best I've ever heard. I was like, I like that. But we were doing these this like charismatic thing. So I was unfamiliar. I mean, I've heard about it, obviously. I'd gone to college, did the thing, so I knew about them, but I never really spent a lot of time in them. And doing this 58 city tour was a big deal because I was in them all the time. And they're so much fun to speak to because they are rowdy. I mean, like, it's not uncommon in the middle of a sermon to someone to just get up and walk around and like have like a flag or something, or even start dancing. And I'm just like, what's going on? Like, for me, I'm like, this is wild. But we were finishing one event one night, and we at the end, that musician guy, he would have like a booth. He had his CDs and stuff, and then I would just stand there and greet people like, oh, thanks for coming. And one guy came up to me, and he started talking. He's like, will you pray for me? This is going on. I would love to pray for you. And then he gets up to me, and I'm like, okay, I'll pray for you. And I went to go pray for him, and I just was kind of like put my hand on his shoulder to pray for him. And when I did, I touched him, and he fell over. And then two people came along and put a little blanket over him. And I remember pulling my hand back going, y'all, that whole rest of the tour, everywhere I went, because the band was like, dude, that freaked you out, didn't it? I was like, I thought I'd killed that kid, right? And I also didn't realize I had this much power. It was very X-Men-ish, right? You know what I mean? Like, and so the whole rest of the tour, everywhere I would go, like I opened the van door and I raised my hand up, and they're all going, whoa, right? Like just touching, it was like, wave, right? It was like Benny Hinnish, like, anyways. So all that to say, I grew up very unfamiliar with tongues. Now, if you're charismatic or Pentecostal, you probably know that. You probably hear, and maybe there's some of you here and you're like, I still firmly believe in it. That's amazing. The Bible for Normal People actually does a great scholarly understanding of how this progressed, because even in the earliest church, it wasn't like it is today. But check this out. There's a lot of argument and scholarship that says it wasn't just like some spiritual uttering that made no sense. That some say now they're starting to realize, well, first of all, it has to do with the Tower of Babel, which is a whole other thing in the scriptures. That's why they go back to it in Acts. But besides that, they're saying it actually was an actual like language. And of course, there was a translator, because in that time, there were all kinds of cultures coming together. So they kind of create. So think about like in Haiti, they have Creole. You know what I'm talking about? Well, when I go there and they speak Creole, I don't know it. So there needs to be a translator. So they're saying essentially like this is actually what's going on. But to speak in this type of language, in the first century, there was a lot of, how would you say this? There was a lot of accolade around it that if you had that gift, if you were able to speak that language, then that meant beyond a doubt you were like super spiritual. Like, I mean, a direct line to the divine. All right, that was a sign that you had it. So Paul immediately goes to the heart of one of the problems here. And he begins with their favorite gift, speaking in tongues. Because there were actual people that were speaking in tongues during the gathering. And apparently, they were speaking so much so in tongues in the gathering, they were disrupting the gathering with like these, quote, spirit, unquote, infused utterances that were unintelligible. But this gift was like highly esteemed and considered one of the highest manifestations of the Spirit that you could get. So think about it this way. If you wanted people to see how deeply spiritual you were in this collective, then they would look and go, do they speak in that language that we don't understand? Because the only people who speak in that language that we don't understand are people that are tapped in to the divine. All right? And Paul goes straight for it. And Paul says, you know what? You can speak in the language of heavenly beings and angels. But if you don't have love, you are a noisy cymbal. This is about showy displays of special inspiration. This is essentially what we could call religious performance. This is about trying to appear more spiritual than the person sitting beside of you. Okay? Now, I know none of you probably know this, but it does not take long to go on Instagram and to see nothing's really changed. It's what I would call hyper-spirituality. Jesus is a brand now. I don't know if you know that. Jesus is a brand, all right? And it doesn't take long to go on, and sometimes I'll see things and I think to myself, my goodness, is that individual trying to convince themselves they're spiritual and in touch with the divine, or trying to convince others they are spiritual and in touch with the divine? But it's these showy displays because you want to present yourself as something other than who you probably really believe you are deep down inside. And hear me when I say there's nothing wrong. If you're here and you're like, oh my God, is he talking about me because I just tweeted my devotional yesterday? You're fine, all right? We don't do that here, all right? Again, you'll understand when we get into love, there's no judgment there, all right? You'll understand. We're going to get further into this. You'll feel this out, all right? Because right now, we're all just coming to this conversation with, by and large, most of us. Some of us have had some experiences, but by and large, you're coming in and most of us have an understanding of love that we have gotten from the Western world. I want to take us to levels that are much deeper soon, okay? But if you're here, please know there's no judgment there with that, all right? So if you're here and you're tweeting and all you ever tweet is like Bible verse stuff, that's great, wonderful. I'm not talking to you, although I will say maybe a good question is why do you do that? You know what I mean? Like you can ask yourself that. I think that's great. But I'm just saying my wife and I have seen people that are like super hyper spiritual. And even when you're around them sometimes, it's like they don't speak English. Do you know what I mean? They speak like, I guess the phrase would be Christianese. You know, everything is like, well, the Lord has just blessed me. And I just think to myself, hey, I want you to know, I actually think it's sacred to be human. So you don't have to try to be something other than you are. Just roll on up in here in your full humanity, and you've got the utmost respect for me that I think you're deeply sacred. Because I actually think at the heart of the material is the spiritual, and I think to be deeply spiritual is to be deeply human. But it's the way that we present ourselves trying to persuade others. And you probably know people like that, right? Do you have one or two in your family? And how bad is this? Now check this out, roll with me here. You ever had those people that you've encountered that, and this is how it feels to me, that sometimes those who talk the loudest about Jesus are actually the ugliest behind closed doors? Somebody speak in tongues. So check out what Paul says. I mean, he comes hard, straight out of the gate. He's like, for those of you walking around with your hyper-spirituality, talking about how much you love Jesus, but you don't have love, I want to be very clear. You are a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, this is a metaphor or an image that Paul is using to make his point. The image is of a harmonious sound coming from the collective in harmony, right? So think of like a choir. Katie grew up doing music education. So in our early days of marriage, she would travel around with these choirs. Think if Vinings Lake was one full choir, right? And we all have our parts, right? You're made up of different parts. Some of you are bass, and I don't know anything about music, so if I slaughter this, someone correct me, all right? Some of you are bass, some of you are treble, some of you are all kinds of different like octaves, like I'm going to be here, I'm going to be here. And think about that. Now, what Paul is saying is, if it's done right, then the collective could produce this beautiful song that the community could hear and their ears would melt at how amazing the harmonies are. But what's happening is you all have your roles, but we're trying to sing together. But if you do that and you do not have love, I want you to know that you are ruining the music. You're ruining it. Without love, you are a deafening, high-pitched roar that is ruining the song. Now, I was just in the back there talking to Milton and Shakira. I love Milton and Shakira. They work with our students back here. And Milton, somehow we got off on talking about music, and Milton plays the trumpet, all right? Or he used to play the trumpet a lot because they went to see one of our students who had like a band thing going on. I was like, oh, how'd it go? Says Grace, says he plays the trombone or something, and Milton was like, I play the trumpet. I was like, I didn't know you played the trumpet. He's like, yeah, I play trumpet. He's like, I don't do it really well. And then he said to me, he said, I play the trumpet. He said, but I said, well, can you play now? And he's like, well, the only song that I really still can do well is the 20th Century Fox song. You know what I mean? Dun, 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 dun. You've heard this, right? Okay. And I was like, that's amazing. I was like, and then it occurred to me, I said, are you like that, the version I've heard? Where it's just so off pitch. Have you ever heard the version that's off pitch? Do you know what I'm talking about? And then I was like, oh my God, this is what Paul, and I'm back there talking to him, and it occurred to me, this is what Paul is saying. I was like, I have to so I don't know if this is going to translate. So I'm going to play something for you here of what I think Paul is getting at. And Taylor, just bear with me here. I know I should have told you this, but it came to me about a minute ago. All right. So here we go. Tell me if you can hear this. That's all Paul's saying. That is all Paul is saying. All right? Paul is literally just saying, this is what you sound like without love. You're ruining the vibe. All right? Now, I'm not saying some of you are here and you're like, that's not me, but I can sure point to people who it is, all right? No, he moves on, all right? So that's what he's saying. He's saying you can have these great gifts and think you're hyper-spiritual and you're like the closest thing to God that's ever come outside of Jesus. That's great. I'm telling you that if you don't have love, you're nothing. And I'm saying you are a clanging cymbal, all right? So you know that, right? I mean, some of the loudest people I know that, I mean, I come from the moral majority. I mean, like Jerry Falwell's crew. This is the crew. Come from all, I mean, some of the loudest voices screaming. But I'm telling you, hear me, there is an absence of love there. An absence of love. And this is why it sounds so like hands on a chalkboard. And if you've ever had that feeling going, there's something not right here. It's like they're speaking, quote, truth, unquote, but they're missing something. Yeah, it's like they're missing a bass note. It's like they have all truth, which is the treble, but they're missing any kind of love, which is the bass. And Paul's argument is not, you've missed out on the truth. Paul's argument is, you've got this over here, but you're missing some kind of a bass note called love. And Paul goes so far as to say, and if you miss it and you don't have love, I want you to know this is worthless. Worthless. So then he goes on and he says this. He says, if you have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge and have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, guess what? You are nothing. This is about spiritual elitism. This is about those who are enlightened. He says all mysteries, all knowledge. Think about that. These are the people that are second tier in spiral dynamics, at least think they're second tier in spiral dynamics, right? These are the people that are self-proclaimed, live in, quote, higher stages of consciousness, unquote. These are the ones who have it all figured out. You've met them before, right? These are the folks that are like, I mean, so far in touch with the divine that they have it. They have the right language. They speak the right language. They speak the right words. They dress the right way. They know it. There is some sense of passive-aggressive superiority. Now, they're not going to come out and wear a badge that says, I'm better than you. But there is a way that they present themselves that perhaps they have a connection with God that is a little more clear than your connection with God. They have a way of understanding the biblical narrative a little bit better than you do. Right? Yeah. This is a part of what I ran into when I left my far right faith, ran to the far left, saw similarities on both sides, so then went to the middle and realized, oh my God, this is awful too. And where do you go from there? I was like, well, I'm leaving all of it behind. Have you ever been there before? I'm like, I'm leaving all of it behind. Just bye. And I went up. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, Paul talks about the second heaven. He's, I don't know if I was in my body, out of my body. I don't know what was on, but I got taken to the second heaven. And for me, I was like, I got to go up. So I went up, right? I went with the Eckhart Tolles of the world. I was like, forget religion. I'm going to be a guru. And all day I just want to sit and go, right? Like I'm going to go fly so high into the highest stages of consciousness that no one's going to be able to talk to me because they won't even understand the language I speak. And as an introvert, I really love that idea. And then what began to happen is I actually did pursue that. I went to the monasteries, and I went to the mystics and the monks, and I went to the people who taught spiral dynamics, and I went to the people who were like talking about second tier, higher stages of consciousness, integral theory. And what I realized was, God, this reeks of superiority, of people that think they're better than others, of people that look down on folks that aren't quite where they are. And anytime you have inferiority or superiority, love is absent. Can I say that? Anytime there is inferiority or superiority, love is not present. That is not love. And this is why Paul says he was on them. Paul says earlier in this same letter in chapter 8, he says, I don't know how to tell you this. I'll sum it up like this. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 8, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. That's what Paul says. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Now, I think it's pivotal for us, and we'll come back to this arrogance again. Paul doesn't stop. He comes back to it. But I think it's good for us as, quote, progressives in here to hear this. This is the one that we need to let sit with us. And I'll just say it like this. If you are filled with pride over how free and enlightened and intelligent you are, in comparison to that family member that you consider backwards, antiquated ways, your new knowledge has simply made you arrogant. So maybe the challenge for us is, let's watch our hearts carefully. Because if we aren't more compassionate, and we aren't more kind, and we aren't more understanding, and we aren't more loving, then we have to ask the question, have we really grown at all? Have we grown at all? I have come across more than I care to admit, not within this collective, but within the larger body, of folks that have walked through a deconstruction of their faith only now to have no tolerance of those who are just beginning the process. I have seen people who apparently believe deconstruction was just some cool hipster thing that happened. And now that it's happened, people are over it because they've had their own experience of it. So they're like, just take me to the next experience. And what I would say to you, if you have deconstructed your faith and it has led to an intolerance of someone who's just beginning to deconstruct theirs, you need to deconstruct your deconstruction. If you are not more loving than you were, if you are not more compassionate than you were, if you're not more understanding than you were, then maybe you need to begin deconstructing yet again. Because this is what Paul is getting at. He's saying enough with the spiritual elitism. Then he moves and he takes it a step further. I love this. He's like, okay, if I give away all my possessions and I hand over my body so that I may boast but do not have love, I gain nothing. Paul keeps moving to great intensity, now including personal sacrifice. You don't have to point fingers, but you know people like this? They will parcel out their property, give food to the poor, and give financially. They will sacrifice whatever it is they need to sacrifice. And Paul is saying you can be extremely generous, but without love, again, you gain nothing. This passage of giving your body over has been debated by scholars, but a lot of folks agree that there's like a textual variation here, that what he's really saying is, some would say, hand over your body to be burned like the martyrs. So the idea is giving oneself up to the most painful of death for some great cause. I call this the tough guy contest. It's a spirituality that seems to be measured by how much you sacrifice for God. Do you know this world? The level to which you sacrificed apparently determines the level and the depth of your spirituality. And so back in my day of growing up, it was a legit thing where pastors would brag about how much they gave up for the Lord. Why would they do that? Because it spoke about the depth of their own spirituality and their commitment to the divine. But it was nothing ever to brag about. I mean, Katie and I know right now, more pastors' kids. I grew up a pastor's kid. She grew up a pastor's kid. I can't tell you how many pastors' kids I know who have literally called me. And I'm telling you, they're in such bad mental shape, and here's why. Because their parents thought that they were doing amazing things by going to the mission field and not showing up for ball games. Because back then, that was like the God noble thing to do. But what we've come to realize now over time is actually the deepest spiritual thing you could do is be at the Little League game. But for them, it was like, there's got to be a sacrifice. You know this type of spirituality? You got to sacrifice something. So what is it you're going to give up? Because whatever it is you give up, that determines just the depth of your own spirituality. So what are you giving up? Yeah. God, have we come anywhere that we're willing to give up our own kids? And if it comes down to it, that's not Yahweh. That's the Canaanite god Molech. Only Molech said, sacrifice your kids to me. Yeah. That's what Paul is getting at. Now, what's the point of all of this? Here's the big idea, and then we're done, okay? You guys have been great this morning on this Mother's Day. And we'll get out of here, and we're going to go celebrate moms and all that stuff. It's going to be amazing, all right? Here's the question. What does spiritual health and maturity look like for you? That's the question I want to ask you. What does spiritual health look like to you? How do you know if you're a spiritually healthy person? Some of us, we know if we're physically healthy. We know that. I know that. I'm 42 now. I know that now more than I've ever known that. I know. The last 2 weeks, I have been on a salad binge. A salad binge. I'm going to tell you why. Because my pants were getting tight. Do you know what I'm talking about? So people are like, do you get on scale? We don't do scales at my house. I don't need to do scales at my house. I do jeans. Do you know what I'm talking about? And I can put them on, and I can tell like where I'm at in the ratio of things. You know what I'm saying? And literally, I am like, hey, I need to cleanse a little bit. And then I go back and I go, what happened? And I realize what happened. I have an addiction, and I need your prayers. I cannot not eat Chick-fil-A. I don't know what it is. But years ago, Eve came along. And she said, you need to take a bite of this spicy chicken sandwich. And I was like, I'm not interested. God told me not to. And she's like, did God say that? You need to be liberated from your bondage. And I'm like, well, I mean... And then there's always that card you throw out, like, even if God said that and you were wrong, surely God is a God of forgiveness. So you just eat it and then ask for forgiveness. And I took a bite of this, specifically this spicy chicken sandwich deluxe. And I took a bite of it, and then, friends, it took a bite of me. And to make matters worse, I was introduced to their Sunjoy. I'm just telling you, I don't care how strong of a follower of Jesus you are. The greatest temptation known to man is Sunjoy, all right? The thing, I took it in my system, and there are a few days that go by that I don't wake up craving whatever cocaine they put inside of that. And I went on a binge, man, and I'm telling you, and I was justifying it. It was like we were busy, we don't have time to make meals. It's like, let's just swing through. Isn't it convenient? Just swing through. Now, look, I love it, but all things in moderation, including moderation. Part of the problem with me is I don't know anything about moderation. You know what I mean? And I struggle with moderation. And so I swing in, and next thing I know, it's Monday. But then Tuesday, I'm not feeling great, and I just want to lift my spirits. So what do you just swing through again? Do you know what I'm saying? Swing. Thursday comes along. Tony calls, like, you want to go try to play a round of golf this afternoon? I'm like, yeah, but I'm really tired because I got up and I wrote a sermon all day for you people. So before I go play golf, I got to get a shot of energy. I'm not going to go to Red Bull. Red Bull's going to give me cardiac arrest. I've got enough. But I'll tell you what will get me there just enough is that sunjoy. So I'll swing through and get me one. And I'll swing through, but then I'll be like, I mean, nothing wrong. I'll pull the bun off. Do you know what I mean? Do you see how you justify? If I pull the bun off, I'll just eat the spicy chicken sandwich. And then the next thing you know, you're a week and a half, 2 weeks, and you're like, my God, have I eaten this every day? Yeah. And so I run 6 miles a day. I'm in the gym. I'm doing it. And I'm going, I don't know why I'm not seeing results. It's not how it works. So I'm asking you this question. I know we take serious our physical health, and I think that's great. I do. I want all of you at your healthiest. We need you here. You have a gift to give to the world, all right? I'm not talking about like fat phobia and weight and all that the Western world is. Oh, God, no. I'm just talking about I want you at your healthiest. I want your heart beating well. You have a gift to give. You're here for a reason. So dial it in. Be here, all right? Enjoy life at the same time. Yes, all I'm saying is if you look after your spiritual health the way you do your physical health, how you doing? How are you doing? And this is why I think many of you come. You're like me. This is like a gym membership to me for the Spirit. I come in here, I'm like, let's work out together. You know what I'm talking about? Anybody else got a problem with the new election coming up? Let's work that out together. Do you know what I'm talking about? That's spiritual exercise. I'm like, this is the best 2 we got in our nation. Can we talk about that publicly? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, let's work it out together. Yes, we are spiritually exercising every time we gather. That's what we're doing. And that's the question that Paul is getting at. He opens this whole phrase, this whole argument that's going on right in the heart of it. He says, what does spiritual health look like to you? What does spiritual maturity look like to you? And here's another question. How can you measure your own spiritual depth? Maybe you word it like this. How do you measure greatness? That's a big one for us. Make America great again. I think part of the problem is, I don't have a problem with the phrase. The problem is we have two completely different understandings of what great is. So is it great for the white man? Or is it great for all? That's a good question. Fair? And then I would ask you, what's greatness for you, for your family? What are you setting out to do? You work so hard. What are you working for? What is greatness? Is your greatness how much power you have at the end of your life? Is greatness greatness for me is my kids are in that school. Greatness for me is my net worth. Maybe it's the title you have. Maybe it's the house that you live in. Maybe it's the car that you drive. I don't know. How would you define greatness? I know it's really hard to live in the Western world and not define greatness that way. Because I too live in a neighborhood and I pass by and I notice cars and houses, and I'm a part of a system that some have a lot more than others, and sometimes it's hard not to feel inferior. You know what it's like? I now, for the first time in my life, back when I was young, I'd have no problem. Like, yeah, of course that man has all that. He's also 52. He's been working half his life. I was great at 20, but then I turned 42, and I see a 22-year-old, and I'm like, oh, that don't work anymore. How'd that guy get that? Because that guy doesn't deserve that. They're like, he just won the lottery somehow, metaphorically speaking. I'm like, I bet he did. And then I conjure things in my head. Bet he cheated. Do you know what I'm talking about? What is that? Just ego, trying to make myself feel good. You know what I mean? Because I'm still measuring greatness this way. I'm still measuring greatness by the clothes that I wear. Have we not grown? I'm still measuring greatness by the car that I drive. I'm still measuring greatness by how many likes I get on Instagram. Are we all, how have we not seen through this and moved on? I'll tell you how, because it's so easy when you're conditioned by the culture that this is what greatness is. And so Paul says, I'll tell you what greatness is. How well do you love those around you? Love is the measuring stick for spiritual maturity. The essence of a healthy and mature spirituality is how well you love. We can measure the depth of our spirituality by looking at how well we love. Measure of spiritual depth is not even how well we talk about love, but how well we actually love. Paul is insisting on how vital love is. To Paul, nothing else matters. Central to healing the division within this collective is an understanding and experience of love, because only this type of love can reconcile and heal the relational divisions around us. And so I don't know what you're using to measure the depth of your spirituality, how you would answer the question, what is greatness? But for Paul, it's simply by how well we love ourselves, the divine, our neighbor, and even our enemies. So I'll close here. Years ago around Bonnings Lake, when we lost everyone, they left, and we had to make some really big shifts. One of the questions we had downstairs as a staff member on the board was, now that we've lost 500 people, how do we define success around here? Because all of us had been raised in a culture where success was how big your church got, and big meant how many people do you have coming, and big meant how much your budget was, but we had moved in reverse. So we lost pretty much all the money, and we lost a good portion of the people. And so then we had to make some decisions. So if that's not success, then what is success? And so we began to just hash it out. It's a great question. I will say this about measuring and success, and I know that you probably have found this to be true. The metrics that matter the most are usually the hardest to measure. The metrics that matter the most are usually the ones that are hardest to measure. Have you found that true? And so I told them, I said, well, Paul's ultimate metric is love. So then it came to the question, how do you measure love? So then we started writing these little statements down. Okay, at Bonnings Lake, spiritual depth and maturity and success is not how many times you come on Sundays. Now, some of you are set free from that. Like, yeah. Spiritual depth is not how many Bible verses you've remembered. That's not spiritual. Spiritual depth is not how much money we have in our budget, how many seats we're filling up. Nope, that's not success for us. Success, we're far less interested in how many people we baptize on a Sunday, and far more interested in how the people that are showing up love their enemies on Monday. That's metrics. So I offer this to you on this Mother's Day. On this Mother's Day, how do you measure greatness? Paul says, try this. This week, try it. Love is the new metric. You can be the most amazing theologian, but if you don't have love, you are the flute on the Fox intro. Do you understand that? Don't be the flute on the Fox intro. We don't need any more disharmony. God, we need some beautiful music to play. So let's crank it up. You with me? I want to crank it up. I want Bonnings Lake to crank it up. I mean a symphony that's all in sync, playing a song that's much larger than ourselves. And the only way that thing is going to feel the way it needs to feel is if we understand the most important thing ever for us, according to Paul, is how well we love. That's it. And I can't say it any better to all of you moms who have displayed and demonstrated that love for us. Thank you. Thank you for what you do.